Hello, YouTube community. It is Miss Cole. As you can see, I am doing a YouTube video with the lovely Mr. Smith. And today we're going to be looking at Macbeth in a bit more detail. We're going to be looking at the theme of guilt today and providing you with some quotations that can help you explore this theme. So here goes.
I'm Mr. Smith. My channel is Teach Smith on YouTube, and we decided on the theme of guilt because of how important it is and how Macbeth and Lady Macbeth have different reactions and different forms of guilt. And I found it interesting, particularly how Macbeth's guilt manifests in one way and Lady Macbeth's guilt manifests in a very different way. I just wanted your thoughts on that.
Macbeth kind of suffers in it in quite a I suppose quite toxic masculinity. It's quite a hyper-masculine way of where he deals with guilt through kind of violence. Whereas Lady Macbeth, we see that she does takes that more of an emotional female or feminine response to dealing with her guilt, which ends in her committing suicide. So we want to kind of look at these two different ways that they both suffer with the guilt of killing Duncan.
If we're talking about the time, so we're talking about traditional roles of male and female roles. So Macbeth, as a Thane of Scotland, he was a very powerful and proud warrior. He would be considered to be, very masculine, or expected to be very masculine, to follow honour codes, to deal with violence, very regularly, and to have a sense of bravery and hiding his emotions. Very much so in this time, because of course Shakespeare was setting it at a time, it was a much more kind of brutal time, a time that was much more closer to, violence was a much more everyday thing, sort of animals, battle, and that was his occupation essentially. His job was to protect his region of Scotland, and also to protect all of Scotland, as he does at the start of the play.
Yeah, and I suppose it's this idea of the chivalry code as well, and this idea of him being a Thane, how he is there meant to kind of protect his king, protect women and things like that. And I think unlike now, we don't really they talk about mental health or things like that during the time. And so I suppose for men like Macbeth, there was no other way of dealing with something so big as PTSD and things like that. And so I think he does react in this way of more violence rather than trying to cope with it within, if that makes sense. And that's the same with Macduff. I suppose when he loses his wife and a child, he briefly mentions this idea of being able to feel the pain, the emotional pain of what he's dealt with. But I suppose in that idea of him being, the masculine figure, he then resorts to violence as well. So it kind of shows, I think, within it, this idea of men having to react in this way.
It's really interesting that you mentioned Macduff in that way, actually, because when he first learns that his family is killed, Malcolm is very quick to say, okay, so revenge it like a man. And he actually is quite forward thinking. He says, look, I will feel it first, and then I'll get my revenge. So obviously still not, you can claim that to be a modern way necessarily of thinking, but certainly more forward-thinking, more progressive than other characters in the play, which is probably partly why he's successful in what he does. He's successful in his aims, and it's another example of a character that is a contrast to Macbeth, and that's so important. Thinking about characters that are contrasting in the play, and in all your literature texts, contrasting characters are so important, I think.
Definitely. And then with Lady Macbeth, we can talk about the idea of how women were seen at the time. We did have Queen Elizabeth I. She was queen just before this was written. And obviously James I was king at the time Shakespeare was writing. But Shakespeare would have written his plays, his earlier plays in, for Queen Elizabeth. So I think we do have ideas of women being strong in some aspects of Lady Macbeth near the beginning of the play, but it's quite interesting how he returns to this idea of women being emotional. But it did kind of annoy me a bit that she does return to this idea of being weak, emotionally, physically and mentally weak in this sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the fact that she's even given the opportunity though is something.
Mm.
And I think again, it's interesting. You're talking about the sort of the change, the shift from Elizabeth to King James.
Yeah.
You know, Shakespeare was a very savvy, you know, he's a businessman as well as
Mm-hmm.
being a poet. And I
Yeah.
think that the idea of, you know, almost hitting back against the image of a strong woman would have perhaps even have appealed to King James,
Mm-hmm.
you know, saying, look, it's a man's job now almost.
Yeah.
And then also thinking about Lady Macbeth, for example, again, being as a contrast, she's very brave.
Yeah.
She's very honest about her husband. She says he's made a mistake. She very openly criticizes her husband, which would have been very unusual. And then she doesn't run from the murderers. You know,
No.
she stays to protect
Yeah.
her children, and she says, "Look, even though I might be the smallest of birds, but I will fight."
Yeah.
So he kind of Shakespeare kind of hints at modernity. I think he kind of hints at what roles may come in the future,
Yeah.
though he can't quite, you know, imagine some kind of 20th century, I suppose, because it's still
Yeah.
400 years ago.
Yeah, agreed. I suppose even the idea of, especially when it comes to Lady Macbeth, the idea of religion, I guess, and the idea of committing regicide. And so it's this idea, I suppose, of looking at the great chain of being, which we spoke about before, in this idea they have affected the natural order of society, you know, with the king being closest to God. And I think that kind of guilt and that kind of sin is the thing that affects them both, I think, a lot, because they do kind of, it's not the natural order for Macbeth to be king, and you know his behaviour after that, and him trying to keep his reign is something that I think leads him to do what he does, and the reason why Lady Macbeth cannot agree with his actions after the death of Duncan in that sense, because she wanted to, I think she wanted the power. As a woman, she was seen as being inferior, and I think being queen was something that she wanted, but I just think Macbeth kind of took it too far.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the religious imagery is so important. I mean, Lady Macbeth believes that she can make hell her ally, almost like almost like being the fourth witch. You have to be careful to say that she is.
Yeah.
Some people will sort of say it outright that she is, and it's not the case. But she attempts to be.
Yeah.
She appeals to hell and says,
the spirits and everything else.
Yeah, and can hell sort of wants hell to shroud, hell to darken the light so that it covers her deed and hides her deed.
Yeah.
But then at the end of the play, or in one of her final scenes, the sleepwalking scene, she is staring into hell, and this time she's afraid.
Yeah.
She is no longer her ally. It's something that's going to damn her and is going to destroy her essentially. And then the same with Macbeth. He just before the quotation we're going to discuss, you know, he says, "I can't say amen."
Yeah.
You know, and that's the point, is that amen stuck in his throat. He knows he knows what he's done. He knows the extent, the gravity of what he's done because of, like you say, the king being chosen by God and protected by God.
Yeah, agreed.
Absolutely.
So with that bit of context, I think that will be a nice way for us then to go into the quotations that we are going to look at today. So would you like to start?
Absolutely. The quotation I've chosen about guilt is, "Will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand? No, this my hand will rather the multitudinous seas incarnadine, making the green one red." Now, I wanted to take you through this in sort of almost levels of analysis, starting with the more basic or foundational, but this shouldn't be forgotten. It's very, very important, and then moving to some more sort of abstract or perceptive ideas. So firstly, just to say, those two words underlined in bold, all and multitudinous, he's talking about every single drop in water in the world. He's calling upon every single last drop of water in all of the oceans, which shows how serious, how severe this act has been, how much guilt this will cause. However, it's still not going to be enough. Now, the word in blue, Neptune's ocean. Now, Neptune is the Roman god of the sea. Why does he speak to Neptune? And that's for two reasons. Firstly, He can no longer pray to the Christian God. As we said before, I cannot say amen, amen stuck in my throat. So the kind of Christian forgiveness, the Christian option has now gone. It's been taken away from him. And then secondly, as he wants water to clean him, and not only water, but all of the oceans, only the God of water has the power to wash away this sin. But even this God will not be able to do it. So blood is guilt. Okay, so throughout the whole play, there's lots and lots and lots of references to blood or bloody. I believe it's in the dozens. And whenever it's mentioned, or almost whenever it's mentioned, it's relating to blood and relating to guilt. You've got the rhetorical question. The reason why we've got this rhetorical question is because he already knows the answer. Okay, he can't be washed of this guilt. He can't be washed of this sin. Because of how serious it is. It's killing a king. It's the worst thing. It's high treason. It's regicide. Now, all the water in the world would cleanse the sin that he has. It is interesting because he does automatically or immediately understand that it was him that did this. He does take responsibility. And you've got that repetition of my hand. Will this blood be clean from my hand? No, this my hand will be unclean. It will always be bloody. So he acknowledges the guilt. Now, these are the kind of things that you should be saying regularly. I also wanted to put in a few more things that are a bit more perhaps pushing your analysis, closer analysis, because we are exploring the quotation. So incarnadine, it means to redden, and this links back to the plagues of Egypt. As some of you may know from the Bible story, the first thing that happened in Egypt when the Pharaoh would not let the Jewish people go was that the Nile went from the natural colour to a blood red. So what he's saying is when Macbeth puts his hands in the waters, instead of the waters washing his hands, the hands will almost infect the water. The sin from his hands, the blood from his hands, the guilt from his hands are so bad. It's so bad that the water will be turned red by it. All the waters in the world. It's so enormous, this sin. It's so enormous what he's done. It's so awful. Another thing I noticed actually when I was setting this slide up that I hadn't realized before, I wanted to pick out the progression. So if we look, we have blood in the first line, then we have incarnadine, which means redden, and then we have red. So his blood on his hands will redden the seas, turning all of them red. So it's that progression from the blood being on his hands to reddening the seas, all of the seas completely red. And again, it shows the extent of guilt, the extent of the sin, how not only will it not be able to cleanse him, he will infect or poison all of the waters. And the final thing I wanted to say was that the final line of this section of this quotation is short of the iambic pentameter. Don't worry if you don't know what that means completely, but essentially, instead of being 10 syllables, it's only 6 syllables. Now, there could be a couple of reasons for this. Please take my word for it, Shakespeare would have done this on purpose. At this moment, Lady Macbeth comes in. So it could be that he doesn't want to show weakness in front of Lady Macbeth, or it could be that the horror of what he's done, or the horror that he feels that the guilt will never be taken away, has finally kind of sunk in fully. So that's why I think the 4 missing beats are intentionally not there. So a really, really rich quotation, a really, really powerful quotation to use in many different exam questions about guilt from Macbeth's perspective.
Nice. So this quotation is from Lady Macbeth. It's, here's the smell of blood still. All the perfumes in Arabia will not sweeten this little hand. And so this comes later on in the play. As you can see from other videos that I do when I explode the quotes, I look at things like the word class, the denotation, the definition of the words, the connotations, so what we associate with particular words, and the effect that it has, so the effect it has on the reader, and what was the writer's overall intention. So you can see that from different colours that have been used. So if we start off with, here's the smell of blood still, the use of olfactory imagery here, so using the sense of smell, it's showing us here the overpowering guilt or sense of guilt that she feels by killing Duncan. We can see here the effect on the reader is this idea that it kind of shows that the guilt is so ingrained within her skin that it's, you know, it's something that she won't ever leave her, it won't ever come off. And again, it's shown us the symptom of PTSD because we know that it's not there, but she's something that she's hallucinating, something that she's constantly seeing because of the guilt of killing Duncan. So as Sarah was saying earlier, we have this repeated idea of the hands and motif of blood throughout. Again, this can relate to this idea of the guilt that they're feeling and the kind of violence behind what they have done. All the perfumes in Arabia. So this is quite interesting because perfumes are linked to this idea of femininity and is something that we use to kind of disguise, you know, smell, for example. So it's quite interesting how it differs to the quotation Mrs. Smith was looking at with Macbeth and this idea of, you know, violence. But here we're showing the kind of, in some way, the weakness of women. She's trying to use a perfume to disguise what she has done, or her part in what has been done. And so it's got the use here of hyperbole, exaggeration, to show us that no perfumes can disguise what she has done to Duncan and what she's kind of done to Macbeth. It was kind of her and witches in this sense that have kind of pushed Macbeth to do what he did. And I suppose his actions after killing Duncan, with killing Banquo, trying to kill Fleance, killing Macduff's wife and children, that's not something that she could predict, and she had no kind of say in the matter. Macbeth acted on his own, and so in some way, maybe the guilt is not just of killing Duncan, but the guilt she feels in pushing her husband to commit these other crimes. The idea of little hand as well is also linking to this idea of femininity, with the idea of her hand being little. And it kind of can suggest to us that she's kind of conforming back to these ideas of a woman's role within society at the time. Women were meant to be seen as weak and it's meant to be inferior and emotional and unable to handle the emotions that they feel. And so in this sense, earlier in the play, she was very much about wanted the spirits to unsex her and to take away her female qualities. But by this point, she's reverted back to the stereotype of women at the time. So again, we have this idea of the hands. Hands were thought to have kind of holy kind of powers. And Aristotle actually said that hands were the instruments for all instruments. And so it's quite interesting how Lady Macbeth used her hands for destruction, for, you know, destroying the natural order, the great chain of being, rather than using it as a form of not only protecting her king, but she earlier wanted to be unsexed in regards to not even wanting to have children in that sense. And the idea of being queen was more important than being a maternal figure. And so I think it's quite interesting here with the use of this idea of hands and the fact that it appears so often within the play. It is showing us that both her and Macbeth will never be able to escape the blood that is on their hands from what they have done. So again, I think there's quite a lot to go with there. And I think it definitely contrasts to the quotation with Macbeth in seeing how they react differently to their idea of guilt. And the fact that, yeah, his is, again, he's playing on the idea of Neptune, who is a god. He is very much this idea of being quite hyper, masculine in this sense, where she's referring to things like perfumes and her little hand. So it does show us the kind of masculine and feminine reaction to guilt, and how maybe people at the time, the different genders would seem to react to ideas of guilt as well.
Yeah, I mean, just the only thing I would say is that you've got all of Neptune's ocean and, sorry, the dog's getting involved. All of Neptune's ocean and all the perfumes of Arabia. Mm-hmm. So even though you've got that violence and femininity, and then you've got the all of the Neptune's oceans and all of the perfumes of Arabia, that hyperbole in both cases.
Yeah, definitely. Shakespeare was, because, you know, he did he was writing for someone like Queen Elizabeth, for example, and he was married to a woman who's older than him as well. So clearly, I think he had quite strong ideas of women and women being strong. Do you think maybe there was a pressure for him in a way from his audience and King to revert to women being inferior in a sense and being emotional?
Yeah, I think King James being in charge, and I think that he almost uses Lady Macbeth to kind of subtly hint at, a more admirable woman, maybe. The other thing I was going to say, actually, about the Unsex Me Here is that it's kind of the idea of that it was hinted at that they lost a child at some point. And I think that it's kind of, if we can't have children, the other way to kind of have a legacy is to take power instead.
Yeah, no, that's nice. I agree with that, actually. Yeah. And so, because even when he was saying she shouldn't have any female children, she should have, male children because of the way that she is as well. I think, I don't know, is there something within her that she never really wanted children? I don't know, because she said she would dash the brains of her baby if she's made a promise. I just think, has she just accepted that she won't have kids, and so the idea of it, creating that kind of violent imagery of what she'd do to her own child, or was something of like power so important to her that actually having children wasn't something that was, I don't know, it's interesting, but I'm going away from the topic of guilt here.
Okay. Not at all, not at all, not at all.
Or maybe it's the guilt of not being able to be a mother in that sense, because I suppose they did have a child before. Does she have that guilt there, and that's why she then sought to have power so much, because of the guilt of not being able to do the things that women are naturally meant to do.
Yeah, and normally did at that time.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's an interesting way to maybe possibly see it. And maybe, I suppose, does Macbeth react in the way he does because she was so much of calling him a coward throughout and emasculating him? Was it in fact her that pushed him to, in the end, do what he's done and react in the way that he did?
Well, it's a share of guilt. Is the classic one. How much guilt do they each share? I mean, I think that I think they both almost share. They seem to share an equal amount of guilt in themselves. It's whether we agree with that is a really interesting question. Is it Macbeth for actually doing it, or is it Lady Macbeth for manipulating him? Should there be a different balance of judgment, basically?
Who do you think's more guilty?
I think Macbeth in the end. I mean, he actually had to do it. He didn't actually have to. At any moment, he could have just turned back and not gone into the chamber and actually killed Duncan. But he did. So he had those thoughts. He said, "Let not light see my black and deep desires." So they were there. So, and like I said, at any point he could have turned it down. Yeah,
it's true.
But then again, that's the great thing about English. You don't have to agree.
No, exactly. But it's great to have these alternative ways of thinking, I think, to get those high grades. I think just having the did it because of this, well, it's fine if that gets you the 6 and 7, but you do have to show those alternative interpretations in order to get those 8s and 9s, people.
Absolutely, I agree.
So we have a question for you. As we are doing home learning at the moment, we thought that you could use these quotations to answer an essay type question. So would you like to share that one?
Absolutely. Okay. So as you know, in your Macbeth exam or your Shakespeare exam, you will get an extract. I've chosen Act 3, Scene 3, where Macbeth hints at the murder of Banquo and Fleance. I won't read it all now, but essentially it shows a point where Lady Macbeth is actually feeling like this should stop, this should end. And I've highlighted some key quotations about this. So Lady Macbeth says, "You must leave this," saying that you must leave the murder of Banquo and Fleance. And Macbeth says, "Oh, full of scorpions is my mind, dear wife." It's a really, really powerful quotation. The scorpions meaning painful thoughts, painful to him, but also lethal for other people. And a lot of people believe that actually, not only is it lethal for other people, it's lethal to Lady Macbeth. It's that he's threatening her, saying, "Don't tell me what to do," essentially. and then you see basically she gives in, and he talks about how she should be kept from the knowledge, be innocent of the knowledge, dearest Chuck. So as we know, you need to start with this moment in the play, you need to start with this extract, explore how Shakespeare presents the theme of guilt. Now, it's really important that you have a balance of both the extract and other quotations in the play. Your English teacher will have taught you very different methods for how to approach this. You may want to start with the extract and really pull it apart, then move on to elsewhere in the play. I know that some other students like to kind of integrate both, but think about how guilt is being demonstrated here by both Lady Macbeth and Macbeth, and then think about how you would bring in the two quotations that me and Miss Cole have discussed at length in your essay. I'm just going to bring Miss Cole in now as well, just to think if there's anything she'd like to add.
Yeah, agreed. I think sometimes some students may get so focused on the extract and not talk about the play as a whole, and it's important that you do both. So as I was saying, start off with this. I definitely think the quotation with full of scorpions is my mind would be a great way to kind of start this. Do it in the same way that we have just been doing it, unpick the quotation in more detail. So zoom in onto words like scorpions, for example, is my mind, to kind of look at that in more detail. What are kind of connotations of a scorpion? How can that link to this idea of guilt, and what that suggests to us about what's going on in his mind? And then be good to link that then to Macbeth's quotation that we've just looked at, and looking at how Macbeth has possibly changed in regards, not changed, or how he feels about this guilt that he is feeling. And then you could bring in this idea of Lady Macbeth. But I think it is good, especially at the grades 8 and 9, to compare, and what we're saying about this kind of masculine way of dealing with guilt and the more feminine way. I think that's definitely a nice way to go within your argument for this, I would say.
Yeah, I think definitely having a line of argument is so important at the high level. Having a thesis, having an idea, having a thread going through your essay. And I think masculinity and femininity is a really, really useful one, definitely.
Yeah, agreed. And then, so yeah, so you should have, what do we say? I would say write at least 3 paragraphs around this, if you have the chance. 1, maybe look at the extract, or 2. What do you suggest? Maybe 1 or 2 look at the extract. I would say maybe 1 the extract, and 1 about Macbeth, the quotation you used, and 1 about Lady Macbeth.
Yeah, I mean, if you're writing a full answer, you probably write more about the extract. However, you know, if you want to practice, you can just do 1 extract and 1 from the 2 others from the rest of the play. Yeah.
And yeah, I think, don't forget to bring in the context as well.
Oh, so absolutely, yeah.
What we're speaking about at the beginning, how can you link this to ideas in society at the time, and even relating to a modern audience as well, and how are these ideas the same? Do we now look at guilt in the same way that they do then? I do think there's quite a lot of similarities still in regards to how different people, especially genders as well, deal with guilt. So maybe that's something that we can look at, you could look at as well, I would say. Even though it's only worth 6 marks, the context, it's still an important part to get into your argument.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's it. That's great. Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
So if you like to maybe share your answers with us, so leaving it in the comment section below, it'd be nice to see your ideas on this and your take on this. Yeah, don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel, do all of that stuff.
Yeah, and just want to say thank you to Miss Cole for inviting me to collaborate on the video. It's been really helpful. Thank you so much.
And if you enjoyed this, maybe we can do some more for you in the future. I think, yeah, enjoy do a bit more Macbeth. So if there's any other themes that you guys want us to look at, maybe that's something we can do for you again in the future.
Absolutely, I agree. Thank you.